just you get to choose. Right? Like here's the scenario. The environment gives us something which can be perceived as negative, can be perceived as not working, can be perceived as problematic. The world's ending. But we get to choose to see it like that, or we get to choose to see it as an opportunity.
So clearly that it's my responsibility now to do that for other people. If I have information and, other people's success is my success and vice versa.
Because you know what? Like, the challenges or the roadblocks are the journey themselves.
There's no big things. It's all little things compounding on top of each other. Christopher Veal provides leadership coaching, facilitation, strategy consulting, and visioning, and other leadership development services. Christopher is an author. His book is called The Whole Man, where he covers the concept of evolving masculinity, moving from an either-or mindset into a both-and approach in order to expand what it means to be a man. Christopher hosts the Vulnerable Man podcast, an ongoing examination of what it means to be a man, and how we as men want to define masculinity and manhood in the 21st century. His goal is quite simple: to destigmatize the word vulnerability for men so that they can better connect with themselves and the people in their world. The Vulnerable Man podcast is on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, and we will include some of those links in our show notes. I did a little review. Christopher has 78 episodes, so that's pretty awesome. And I had a chance to listen to some recent episodes. But without further ado, let's bring him on here. Christopher, thank you for joining the PAC podcast.
Happy to be here. Glad to be here, gentlemen. Looking forward to this conversation and where we go in it.
Awesome. Masculinity, vulnerability. I like to, especially before we go deeper, that's our favorite thing, to define, make sure we have some common language around, maybe even both of those things, masculinity and then vulnerability. How would you define those, Christopher?
Sure. I think one of the things that I'm a big believer in is it varies depending on who the individual is. And so I'm not a believer in that we have to have one set definition, but really a common language around it. So I love that you're pointing to it. And it's, how do I define how I want to show up as a man? And what are the expectations for me in society and in my family and in the roles that I fill? And one of the reasons that I address this is typically there's a very narrowing way that masculinity is looked at. We often talk about things like the man box and the rules we have to live by as men. And it tends to be limiting. It's very much either or type of thinking. Either I can be a breadwinner or I can be a caregiver. Either I can be strong and independent or I can ask for help and show that I need help. And for me, where I think it needs to shift is that when we talk about masculinity, it needs to be more expansive and inclusive, and it shifts to a both and type of thinking. So I can be a breadwinner and a caregiver. I can be strong and independent and say, sometimes I need help. And so that's a big part for me of how we're shifting the narrative, and especially how we're helping people look at the way we hold masculinity.
Very succinctly put. We've had some previous episodes on crucial conversations, and one of the tactics in there is to identify win-win. And what happens when we're in that either or category, our brain shuts down and stops solving for the problem that we actually want to. So are you familiar with that? Is that
absolutely? I used to teach the crucial conversations content, so I love it. It is great stuff.
Yeah. So I love that both and then my natural question of all the things that you could have worked on and focused your attention on, why this? What was there, a catalyst? Was there something that came up? Was this just a big problem that you feel needed to be addressed? Why masculinity and vulnerability here?
Yes, the short answer is it's a reflection of my own journey. So I spent 9 years in the Marine Corps as an infantry officer, got out of the Marine Corps and went into construction doing project management. So those are both very, what I will typically say, hyper masculine fields. And while I was successful in those parts of my career, I also felt like I could only bring limited parts of myself, and I had to leave other parts in other places. And in 2012, 2013, I discovered Brene Brown's work around vulnerability. And that really got me thinking about things, and particularly looking at how did I hold this idea of vulnerability? Because for a long time, it was a 4-letter word that I wouldn't utter in mixed company. And as I started to explore it, I realized I had a very negative connotation of what vulnerability meant, or I had a very narrow way of the way I would let myself be vulnerable. And I started to look at how was that impacting my relationships. And as I dug into it more, what I realized is the more I leaned in and was willing to be vulnerable, the richer my relationships became, the deeper the connection became, and the less I had to worry about what did I tell this person or what story or who do I need to show up as. And I was able to accept myself more and trust in myself. So I think that's really core. And I will say another piece that was important in that is that my daughter was born in 2009. And I had an interesting experience because I was working with a construction company at the time around taking paternity leave, and actually had to educate my organization. And there were a lot of men that were a generation older than me and had a lot of negative comments about it. Like, what are you doing taking maternity leave, and raising kids is women's work. And part of what I realized is if I had succumbed to a lot of that group think, I would have created more distance and not had the connection with my daughter that I do. And because I was willing to be vulnerable and say, you know what, I want to be here and be present, it had me lean in where I might normally default to leaning out.
Wow, Christopher, I think you've answered all the questions I had about like
Okay,
how
well,
great
then we're done.
you told the story in such a great way. Because my thought was, how did you? What was the experience that you got into that? But I love the connections with Crucial Conversations. Brené Brown, she is one of my favorite quotes that I often say. Being clear is kind, being unclear is unkind. I just love that so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, just leaning into that space. And I was just thinking about one of my neighbors who I hung out with last weekend came over to my house, and I always think as a coach that I want to tell it as it is. Like I want to get deep, I want to get real, and it was just a personal relationship for me. But it's like I gotta ask him some real questions, right? And I gotta be real, really honest. And then we're planning for a Christmas party around our house, like an adults only, and we're doing which we've never done before, which is gonna be fun. And me and my wife are doing a guest list, and there's people that she was wanting to put on there, and people that I wanted to put on there, and I found some resistance in some of those things. And I was like, why? Like, I like these people. Why wouldn't I want them to come? And it's attached to, of course, what you just talked about, Christopher, saying, do I only want to show up in a certain way for certain people?
Yes.
Rather than just being my whole self all the time. And it should be the easiest thing in the world to do, right? But
yeah, well, something that also plays into it is I've been interviewing men since 2015 around the subject of vulnerability. And I particularly got curious about what gets in the way of men being vulnerable with other men. Because a lot of the men that I know are willing to be vulnerable to a greater extent with the female partners in their lives.
Yeah.
But when it comes to male friends, we have this kind of unspoken bro code that we can't breach. And so while we know we care about each other, we don't say it. And that really got me looking at, so what gets in the way for men being vulnerable with other men? And as I've been talking with men, it typically comes down to one or two things. They're either worried about being judged or being seen as less than.
Yeah.
And as I'm talking with them, I say, okay, so if a good buddy of yours shared something that he was struggling with, what would you think? And generally the men would say, I'd have a lot of respect for him. Wow, I'd feel honored that he told me that. Or, you know what, I appreciate his strength and his courage in telling me that. And then I'd just sit back and wait. And eventually the wheels would turn, the light bulb would come on, and they'd realize, oh, wait a minute. When I think of vulnerability in others, I see it as a strength. But when I think about it myself, I consider it a weakness. And so that's part of what I'm also on a mission to do, is how do we shift the narrative so that people see examples of men being vulnerable? Because if you look at most of what's in the media, it's the stereotypical alpha male, chest thumping, my voice has to go like this for some reason, and I win at all costs. When we see the men that are vulnerable and emotionally available, they're their comic sidekick. And so what that unspoken message that young boys get and young girls and everybody gets is, to be a real man, whatever that is, I have to be that strong, independent, show no feelings guy. And we know that's not serving us because it's literally killing us. Suicide rates for men in the US are 4 times what they are for women and any other group. And it's because we're not willing to talk about this stuff.
Mm. How do you change a culture like that? Is it like the book, podcasts, conversations like this?
That's what I'm still trying to figure out. And what I do know is it's helping to shift the narrative. So part of it is the messaging that we get. If you think back, I'll speak to myself. Growing up as a young boy, if I looked at the examples of men and masculinity in the media in particular, I love using that example. But I grew up, I was born in the 70s, so child of the 70s and 80s. Who were the big action stars? Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And what kind of characters do they typically play? These heavily muscular, loner, do it all, and like not shed a tear type of thing. Mm. And so the message it creates is that's what it means to be a man. And so if not just, like I said, young boys see that, if little girls see it and go, that's what it's supposed to be, then we create this narrative. And so to your question about how do we change things, we need to start bringing more examples of men showing a broader range of what it means to be a man. Because it's not, listen, I don't know how to change an engine in a car. I can't do that. Does that make me less of a man than somebody who does? I don't think so. But if that's the standard by which I'm being judged as a man, can I go hunt? Can I go fish? Do all that stuff? If that's our judgment, if that's our bar of what it means to be a man, then we're doing a disservice to all the other ways that men can show up and be productive and supportive in the world.
Can you think of anybody, is there anybody in the media and movies, like are there good examples now of, who we can watch? I guess one of my favorite podcasts, I bet you haven't heard of it, but his name is Theo Vaughn. He's a comedian, and his podcast is called This Past Weekend. And he gets on there, and there's some interjection of like humor in there, and it's very entertaining. But he talks about his feelings. That's what the podcast is, and he has a huge following. It's grown. He'll post a video, and within 2 days he'll have 500,000 views on it. So that's somebody who's I don't like to use the word hero, but like an example for me of like somebody who's willing to go there and talk about that, and in front of a huge audience of people he doesn't even know. Like there's a strength in that too. So I don't know, just reflecting on that. Do you know of anybody, or could you point to anybody if somebody's thinking of, who that might be as they listen to us?
Sure. Well, as you say that, I think the thing I'm celebrating is that podcast probably wouldn't have existed 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So the fact that Theo, and I haven't heard of his podcast, but I will check it out, but that he can create this, and it's a man sharing about his feelings and people are wanting to hear it. Part of what I hear in that is we want more of that. And so the more we can highlight things like that and not make them the comic relief or the sidekick or the less than, that's how we start to do it. I think about, again, I come back to the media a lot. So growing up, the TV dads that I saw were often the bumbling, aloof guys that like, we celebrate that the kids didn't die and the house didn't burn down. Now we know that fathers are capable of much more of that. If I think more recently, on Modern Family, Phil Dunphy. Now he's maybe not a perfect example, but he was a guy who was a good dad. He was maybe let's say, be real. He was a lot goofy, but you got to see him genuinely being a dad and caring for his kids. And so I think that's an example of where we're seeing a different portrayal of men, and that we can be that role of caregiver too. And as we start to get more and more examples, I think that's what I'm dreaming into, is that we will have the examples of that's the rule, not the exception. But, I'll say also 5-10 years ago, I wouldn't have even dreamed of having a podcast called The Vulnerable Man, because who's going to want to listen to men talk about vulnerability? And what I know is there's a lot more people in this conversation and are coming at it from different angles. And that's what's helping us to change the way we hold it.
Why do you think that is? Is there more of a demand? Is it like when people hear these things talked about, it's like, yeah, I kind of sort of believe in that too. So is it like the demand is creating these outlets, or like the leaders and the outlets are putting the message out and it's resonating with people and people are flocking? Or does it even matter to assess that?
Yes, is the answer. And I think it's both.
Yeah.
So I believe that we're at a place now where, particularly with millennials, they are more open to the idea and not necessarily as willing to fall into the way we shape the man box and what we expect of men around it. So I think that's part of it. But I also think more men are open to saying, you know what, here's something that I want that I haven't had. Even again, 15, 20 years ago, to have men talk about their feelings, we would have probably laughed at them. And now we can have these conversations and it feels more normal. So I think it's both of them that are occurring. And I also think it's also because in a way the media is good. As we're starting to see more examples, it reaches more people. And then it has people go, oh, wait, I just saw him do that. Maybe I can a little bit more too. So it's a chicken and an egg, and I don't know for sure what the answer is.
I like that we're all coaches here. I'd like to get Coach Nick's thoughts on this, because we interact a lot and talk about our practices and all that. But I think that's part of what we do, don't you think, Coach? With like we create the environment for, most of my clients are men, and we very regularly have conversations about emotions. Like that's part of it. It's part of the navigating of it. Maybe it's the privacy of that one-on-one time that lends the safety there, but it's part of our role as coaches. This is the question. It's part of our role as coaches to build that safety so that this new idea of masculinity can be practiced.
Yeah. It's so often that clients will come to me and they want to work on their business. But then, of course, we work on everything else.
Yes.
It's,
Right.
it's a combination of business, health, physical and mental, family, being a better husband, being a better father, and then some sort of connection to the community or give back or your spirituality, whatever resonates for you. It's always the same
Absolutely.
stuff. It's just what's the initial connection piece, right? And so
Mm.
what's cool about your focus, Christopher, of course, is that it's direct to that. And by looking at that, then I suppose I'm making a leap here, but tell me, I mean, that's what like the book's about, right? Like the whole man approach, right? Is that the connection there, or did I get that wrong?
Absolutely. You know, part of what you're talking about is, and similar with me, I have a lot of clients that will come to talk about work related stuff. And what we also know is we're more than just the jobs we do. And so
Yeah.
as we start to uncover some of the things that are there for them personally, that maybe they've been keeping at arm's length, it transforms the way they're able to show up in their professional, in their personal relationships, and it changes everything. And so for me, I believe it is. We have to look at all elements of who we are, but also how do we want to be showing up? Because again, if we keep falling into this narrative that we think we have to be in, then that keeps us playing smaller. And when we realize we can get to be whatever version we want to be of it, you know, a gentleman I interviewed for my podcast a few episodes ago talked about authentic masculinity. And I loved it because for him, he said it's whatever it means to me and how I want to show up as a man in a way that's not harmful to others.
Mm.
And so again, I'm never going to say there's one right way to be a man. And let me be clear, there are some great things about being a man, but there's also some stuff that's doing harm to us in the world. So patriarchy, for example, men suffer from patriarchy. And usually when I say that, people go, that's not true. What? But it does. It keeps us limited too. And so how do we keep, for me, one of the reasons that I used evolving masculinity as the subtitle for my book is when we think about in nature, organisms, when they evolve, they keep what works for them and then they adopt new behaviors to survive and thrive in the new environment. And that's what we need to do with masculinity. Keep the things that are working, let go of what isn't, and then figure out how do we need to behave and shape masculinity going forward so that we can be part of the solution and not part of the continued problem. So I don't know if I quite answered your question, Coach Nick. I think I did, but if not, you can ask.
Well, it just kind of got to that in my thought process, right? Because it's everything together, right? And so, how do you help people that come to you and say, like, I want to go on this path, Christopher, with you, right? What does it look like?
The short answer is I tell people you find your own way because what worked for Christopher may not work for you. Now, what I am happy to do is I'm happy to be a guide for you. What I've learned along the way is how people receive my vulnerability is not a kind of determination or judgment on how well I'm doing it. And it took me a while because initially when I started showing up in these spaces and being vulnerable, I would introduce myself and say, I'm a former Marine, 6 years in construction. And they would automatically have a preconceived idea of how Christopher was as a man, right? You probably did too through no fault of your own. And then when they see me show up with some vulnerability or bring it into the space, it has them kind of sit back sometimes and go, whoa. And what I love about that is it gets them thinking. And they probably go, wait a minute, if this guy who's been in combat can be vulnerable, what's stopping me? And so that's a big thing that I'm a proponent of is I like to say giving someone the gift of going second. And what that means is I'm willing to be a little bit vulnerable. You may or may not be willing to do the same, but even you hearing me be vulnerable has you think about it differently and maybe be open to it. And so that's where it starts.
It's beautiful. It's like, yeah, you use me as your evidence. It's like you haven't got to
Yeah.
go and figure out, okay, here it is right now.
Yeah. That's also part of why I started the podcast because I realized not everybody relates to Christopher's story, but I want to highlight the stories of other men on their journeys, the successes, the failures, because they may go, oh, you know what? I heard Coach Josh on there and I can relate to his story. And that might have them go, maybe I'll be a little more vulnerable with my friends too.
Yeah, open it up even more. It's beautiful. So what are some of the habits of a whole man? Like what does it look like?
So I use the analogy of capes because I play with this idea of superheroes in it. And so capes are the habits of the whole man. So it starts with curiosity. And that's, and you're going to be familiar with this one being coaches, but it really starts with a question or a wondering and an openness to explore. And you will continually come back to curiosity. That's a constant thread.
Yes.
The second, the A is awareness. And that's about recognizing where you are now and where you want to go. Knowing that you can make adjustments along the way, but not just waiting until you have the perfect solution. Mm-hmm. The P is for presence. And for me, that one I struggled with early on. For a long time, I was so busy with the doing of life that I didn't slow down and actually just be in the moment. So presence is about slowing down and connecting, filtering out the distractions, and being present to your life in this moment. The E is emotional health. And that's about building and sustaining emotional well-being, what I call developing emotional fitness. And then the S is stay. And that means you got to remain and do the work and not run when it gets hard. And I always tell people it's not necessarily going to be easy, especially when we're trying to make big changes in ourselves. And the willingness to stay and make adjustments as you go is what's going to have us make the progress.
Love it. I'm feverishly taking a whole bunch of notes here. I love that because they're all tied together, of course, right? And we want to have a way that we can remember it and think about the curiosity, because you've got to start with that. Me and Coach often say that everything starts with awareness. It's not enough, but it starts with awareness. I suppose you could say before that, it starts with a curiosity to be aware. And then that's a process of being, actually understanding what it is that you want, what you really want. But I love that the presence is such a big thing, right? Would you also say?
I knew you were going to bring that up, Coach. I knew your ears perked up when you said presence.
You know me too well.
Uh-huh.
It's the slowing down, of course, is really important, right? As coaches, you would say you can't stop and smell a rose at a sprint. But,
Yeah.
So tell us a story about that, if you would, Christopher. Like, how have you made that shift for you?
I think for me, one of the biggest things is I'm very conscious of this device. Right? We all have ours. Well, I'm not necessarily throwing away because it is an important thing. Technology is a powerful tool. And, like the movie says, use it for good, not evil. With great power comes great responsibility.
That's right.
But for me, one of the things that I do is I'm really conscious of when I'm getting into a conversation with somebody, I put my phone down. I put on do not disturb. Or if I'm in a conversation with somebody online, I mute my notifications so that way, if something pops up, I'm not that, oh, what's that? Because what it does is it instantly creates disconnection. That person goes, oh, wait a minute. There's something that Christopher might think is more interesting. And so I practice it, whether it's a virtual connection or a real in-person connection. And for some of my friends and family, it was awkward at first because they were like, wait a minute, Christopher, like this feels really intense. But for me, what I know is if I'm really, truly present with you, that's one of the biggest gifts I can give you. And I know for me, if I'm having a conversation with someone, I see them kind of glance at their phone. Part of what I'm thinking is, okay, they're ready to be done with this conversation because clearly they're not interested in being here. And so that's how I continue to practice the presence. And again, I don't always get it right. Sometimes I will stumble and miss, but I'm getting better and it's a work in progress.
Well, you mean you haven't got it all figured out?
No, it turns out I am human, right? I'm on my own journey too, but it's getting better. And that's the gift in things.
I was with a friend of mine a few weeks back and we were standing up and he was quite animated, telling me something that was important to him. And it wasn't his phone, but his Apple Watch must have vibrated on his arm. And he just stopped mid-sentence that he was really passionate about to go,
yeah.
And he just carried on going. He didn't, but it shows you how we're so trained in that space. So it's a great distinction to be able to do that. And it's a real practice of that muscle that you will continue to help you everywhere else. So really cool.
I'd like to make a comment about presence before we start to wrap up here too. I came across an Instagram video, speaking of our phones, the other day, where there was a side-by-side video of a dad and his child, I think it was his son, of a situation that happened when the son walked into his room, and the left side was when the dad was on his phone, not paying attention, and the right side was him being present. And it was like a 4-minute video, and it just walked through the difference of the disconnectedness. It was so powerful.
Life, right?
There's life. So I'm going to challenge producer Rob to see if he can overlay. I want to include that in this episode if it's possible to show just the power of what we're talking about. But presence is so huge, right? If you're there focused on something, you're so powerful, right? There's so much to give in that moment.
But here's what I want to jump in and say.
Yeah.
Nick, I love the fact that you just put this aside to be present there, because actually that's what's most important.
Yeah.
It could have been very easy to go, but I got to do this. So thank you for modeling exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And
perfect.
The difference it will make for that little one, you may not ever understand. So ta-da.
So true. Yeah. Divine timing there for sure.
Yeah.
Christopher, I want to give you a chance to plug. Where can we find you? People are going to want to talk to you after they watch this interview here. So, any website, book, everything, give it to us.
Absolutely. So here's the best places. If you look for me on LinkedIn, You'll know you found me because it has Vulnerability Vanguard as part of my title, so you'll know that's the right me. If you're looking for information about the book, the website is wholemanjourney.com. The podcast is vulnerable-man.com. And then my business is Echelon Left, ECHELON-left.com. And, again, happy to connect and talk with people. I do a lot of work in a lot of spaces, and in particular talk with a lot of leaders and leadership teams around inclusive leadership. That's a big passion of mine right now. And it's probably going to be the theme of my next book, but more to come on that one.
Love it. Thank you so much. Really interesting topic. And I think, like we said, people are becoming more and more drawn to it. So thank you for sharing everything. And we'll connect again with you soon here.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate being here with you.
Thank you for watching another episode of Truth Seekers. We appreciate your interaction. So please comment, like, subscribe to YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want more, check out some of our links to our masterclass, The Achiever's Mindset, and come join our LinkedIn group. And what do you want to see more of? Remember, we're here to share the simple secrets of successful. So help us do that. What do you want to see? What do you want to see more of? Thanks, and see you again next time.